Hello and welcome to the third session of our workshop series about formal students with SimScale in collaboration with Formal Student Germany. Yes, I'm very happy to see so many of you again joining us today. And I think you already know the procedure. Before we start to talk about today's topic, I would like to make sure that everybody can hear us loud and clearly. Therefore, guys, in the case you can hear us, please press the raise your hand button. And then we know that everything is working. Great, I already see a lot of fans, perfect. In the case, for some reasons, you cannot hear us anymore, try to rejoin the webinar, or you can alternatively also use our toll-free audio service numbers. You just have to dial one of these toll-free numbers and enter following access code, and then you are able to listen to the audio of this webinar through your phone. Yes, let's take a look at our today's agenda. During this session, we will talk about development strategies. So at the beginning, I will just quickly talk with you about some organizational aspects of this workshop. Just after that, I'm very happy and glad that Torbjörn Larsson will join us and introduce you to some very important aspects of CFD methodology and result evaluation with the help of post-processing. And just after that, we will have a live demonstration where I will show you how to modify our last work simulation in order to increase the accuracy. And after that, I will present you your homework and we will have time for the Q&A session. Great, so as you know, this is the third session and we are right now on the final straight of this workshop series. And during the last 2 weeks, you get introduced, let's say, to really the fundamentals of aerodynamics, but also to the fundamentals of CFD. And you learned how to simulate a Formula Student racing car with the aid of SimScale. And you may ask yourself, well, this is very nice to create such simulations and these colorful pictures, but how can this help to improve my car design? And that's what we will talk about during the next 2 sessions. So today we have Torbjörn with us. And next week, Nick Perrin will join, the former head of track aerodynamics at Mahler F1, who will talk with us about CAD model management and how to get started quickly with simulation based on your own models. Yes, finally, since again some people joined the first time this week, we are going to record this webinar, and I think tomorrow we will send around the recording link as well as some other related resources. And if you submit all 4 homeworks, you can qualify for a certification and a professional training, as well as a free professional subscription for your formal student team. If you have questions, just write them into our question box, and my colleagues Anna and Akram will try to answer them during the session in the chat, or if the questions are maybe related to a larger audience, we will answer them also during the Q&A. Great, then I'm very happy to pass the word over to Torbjörn. Have fun and talk to you later.
Hello, this is Torbjörn Larsson. I hope you can see my screen now, and thank you very much, Milan, for having me on this show. It's a pleasure to be here. I will try to share with you a little bit of my experience from working in Formula 1 for close to 15 years. And my role has always been CFD, aerodynamics development, and also methodology. I started more than 15 years ago at Sauber F1 and built up the CFD model, CFD group more or less from scratch. And I spent close to 10 years before moving over to Ferrari F1, where I was responsible for CFD methodology there for about 4 years. So I will give you kind of a short background of the history of CFD in Formula 1, how it has evolved over the years and how it looks in the future. We'll try to say a few words in general about their development strategies. What is the philosophy? What are the important things when you try to develop a race car in terms of aerodynamics performance? Obviously, I have to be very brief and short, but hopefully give you some kind of ideas. Then I will move into, which is a very broad topic, which is CFD methodology and some kind of methodology modeling strategies. And I think already from the first and second session you had in this workshop series, you start to get some ideas of what is important, things to think about, mistakes to avoid, and I will touch on a few of those subjects and try to give you some, at least some guidelines what is important in terms of model preparation and to set up simulations and really what to look for and mistakes to avoid. Finally, I think we is really the core of the presentation. We should look at what comes out of the CFD simulation, and because in the end we would like to look at the results. We would like to do some kind of data evaluation, do some post-processing, and based on that we want to evolve our race car and make it even more efficient. So I will talk about something, what we should look in terms of surface flow, near surface flow, wake flows, and what are the important structures to look for and so on. And that's kind of my idea with this presentation. But let's start a little bit about evolution of CFD in Formula One. This is an old picture I'm sharing with you that was presented by Fluent Germany for many, many years. But it's kind of a nice illustration of the past in Formula One. When I entered around 2000, the methods were not extremely mature. And we can only handle, say, relatively coarse models, and it was really only the top teams that were using CFD to any significant extension. But then, say, from 2000 and the years to come, in 2005, 6, there were really a big push among the teams to develop the methodologies and the techniques, and we saw that more and more of the teams were using supercomputers at that time. And okay, so I was stuck here a little bit in presentation mode, but about 2006, when I was working at Sauber, I could say we were kind of leading the CFD race when we introduced what we called Albert 1 and Albert 2. It was kind of the first supercomputer entering in Formula 1. And the other teams, they were not late to follow, and it was kind of a race going on between the teams who had the fastest supercomputer, who was the best team developing in the cars with the aid of CFD. And it was kind of a spiraling effect, and really the teams agreed in 2009 that this is becoming very costly, spending a lot of money building up supercomputers and so on. So they agreed to put a limit, put a cap on aerodynamic testing, both in the wind tunnel but also in CFD. But even still, if we look back, you can really say that Formula One has been kind of a catalyst in developing state-of-the-art CFD techniques. The teams were really pushing the technology in terms of hardware and software, and they were pushing the software really early on to say that we need to run bigger models, we need to have more efficient tools for meshing, solving, and post-processing and so on. And they became really advanced users for high-performance computing, as I mentioned about running supercomputers. And this is kind of an interesting chart here, which represents the top 500 fastest supercomputers in the world. So the golden curve here is the fastest computer in the world over the years. And the vertical axis here is kind of the performance in the flops of the computer. And this is a logarithmic scale, so we go from gigaflops, teraflops, petaflops, and exaflops. And then we have the year here on the horizontal axis. And if we see then around 2005 and 6, 7, represented here by the red dots, the Formula One teams, they were well on the top 500 list, meaning that they have supercomputers that was among the fastest in the world. But then when those limitations were introduced in 2009, and they're still in place and have become even more strict, we can see now that today they are not really on the top list anymore. They're kind of falling off the chart a little bit. So today I would say they are not the industry that are really pushing in terms of developing the state-of-the-art techniques. But hopefully this will change in the future, and then this cap will be removed, but that remains to be seen. Anyway, let me say a few words about aero development strategies, and I'll try to introduce the concept of aero mapping. And this is really the key to develop the aerodynamics performance of the race car. Because basically we have to evaluate the car at many different what we call operating points, and that could be like the attitude or the position the car takes in high-speed cornering, or maybe during braking or end of a straight, because depending on the conditions, the car will find another ride height, another setup from suspension, and we really need to evaluate the car at many different of those operating points. And we have to understand, like looking at various racetrack, in what conditions are this car spending most of its time, and where it is important to optimize the car in terms of aerodynamics performance. And then we take these different kind of ride points or operating points, and we try to weight them differently. And what we in the end would like to come up with is one single number, which is kind of a merit number. I call it here CZ merit. So CZ would be kind of a measure of downforce in this case. So I would like to find an equation that gives me one single number that I want to optimize the car against, and that can then be a different combination of, say, the downforce in end of a straight, weighted with a certain number here, W1 for instance, and then I add another performance point, maybe during high-speed cornering, and the car has a bit of a roll angle to it, or maybe we have a bit of a steering angle on the front tires, and that I have to weight it in somehow. And how should this formula look like? Well, this is, I guess, the million-dollar question, and this is where all the know-how of the designers come to play. And depending on if you're optimizing for a high-speed track or a low-speed track, I'm sure this kind of CZ merit function will look very differently. But at the end of the day, we are not optimizing for a single condition, because we are optimizing for a combination of set of conditions, and that's really important to understand, I think. The same thing comes then when we want to aid the development in terms of CFD. Ideally, we would like to evaluate all those operating points also in our CFD simulation, and that could then mean, at the end of the day, that every single operating point is a new CFD model. Or if we can find a way that we can just change the mesh on the fly in a way, I call this mesh morphing. So what we see here on this picture is that we are kind of changing the ride height dynamically in the CFD model. So the car, the ground plane here in those pictures are fixed, the tires are standing fixed to the ground, and then we move the suspension and the bodywork to represent different ride heights of the car. And in this way we find an efficient way then to model all these different operating points. So just to give you kind of an idea, what we see here is not the true representation of a Formula 1 car. It's more like a generic simplified model where we test the techniques. But this was something that was done maybe 15 years ago, and today the tools have matured quite a lot, and these kind of things are possible to do today with CFD modeling. So that was kind of a very brief introduction on a little bit of CFD, how it's been used in Formula 1, and today they are, as I told you, they are limited in terms of regulation, what they can use, but I can assure you they're really pushing hard in terms of methodology, in terms of efficiency, and that is what I want to talk a little bit now in terms of CFD methodology. And I'm just going to try to give you some kind of very general recommendations, what to think about when you start to prepare your model. And let's start obviously with the CAD model preparation. Once you have your CAD or surface description of your car, whether it's like true CAD NURB surfaces or there are maybe STLs, there are certain things to think about. And first of all, what I really would like to say that you cannot really spend enough time preparing your CAD model. because end of the day, what comes out and in the end in terms of flow results, it's going to very much depend on how well you prepared your CAD model. So be very cautious, take your time when you prepare the CAD, because it pays off, because if you find problems down the road in the process, you might have to go back all the way to CAD to fix them. So it's very important to think that this is really what's going to give you good results if you spend some extra time preparing your CAD. And first of all, try to make it as clean as possible. And I also would like to urge you to try to simplify it as far as possible. If it has a lot of small features, think to yourself, do they need to be there? If you have small nuts and bolts and pieces or small tiny gaps, well, if they really are important, then you have to take the time to really resolve them also in the end in your mesh. And then that could cost a lot in terms of cell counts and so on. But if they are really small, there are good chances also that the effect they would have on the final results are also quite small. So quite often the best practice is try to remove them and make the CAD as clean as simple as possible. The other thing to think about, try to avoid very say, acute angles, narrow angles where we have surfaces meeting almost parallel. And a good example of that where we have to be a bit careful in terms of modeling this kind of race car is where the tire meets the ground. In the real world, in an actual tire that deforms, it has a reasonably large footprint or contact patch, and that obviously depends on the load of the car and it will change and so on. But the tires is very say flat and parallel to the ground, and to model that exact tire in CFD is actually very difficult. So we have to do something to avoid that kind of acute angle, and I think Milad has shown that in your previous session that you add a little bit extrusion there to just to be sure that you get a very good mesh in the end and that you get consistent results. This is one area that is important, but just in general, think about it. If you have surfaces meeting at very narrow angles, think about the possibility to actually put in cells of good quality, because what the measure is trying to do for you in the end, it will fill that region with small cells. And if those cells need also to be of good quality, and then in the end there will be very small cells to fill that tiny gap or that acute angles. So either you end up with extreme amount of cells or you end up with cells of very bad quality. So look through your model, try to avoid those areas where we have acute angles, and what you have to do is then to compromise the geometry somehow. You have to put in some kind of fillet, some kind of radius, but that's much better than to end up with a lousy mesh in the end. So a few tips and recommendations then on mesh generation. Here, what's the important things to think about? Well, you're using tools now that SimScale are providing for you, so meshing in principle is quite straightforward. It has been set up for you with a very nice template, so most kind of things are already in place. But in general, when you start a project, always try to think about your constraint. We all have constraints in terms of times. When do I need to deliver these results? What can it cost, or in time, in money, or whatever. We have some constraints. Try to equate that to some kind of cell budget. How kind of a large model can I afford to run? Can I afford to run this in steady state mode or unsteady transient simulation that will cost you much more? Try to equate that to some kind of a cell budget, and then you have to do the math backwards and to understand how to build your model. It's kind of, in the end, will be a compromise between accuracy and time. Also try to think about what are the scales that we need to resolve here to capture the physics. Those are typically the scales, in spatial scales, resolve in space. Could also be time scales, but we're mainly talking about steady state simulations here. But if we expect to see large structures propagating, say we have a structure propagating from the front wing, we have to make sure that we create a mesh that also preserve that structure when they sort of propagates down the car and all the way to the rear wing and maybe the rear diffuser behind the car. So we need to have a mesh that is fine enough to capture those scales without dissipating them too quickly. That's kind of another very generic rule here to keep in mind. The other thing obviously is that we cannot afford to have equal cell sizes everywhere, because then the cell count will go over the roof basically. So we need to have some kind of strategic kind of cell allocation, and obviously we need to resolve the mesh in areas where it's important, where we have strong flow gradients, typically near the surface of the car, or areas where we expect flow structures to propagate. Maybe there are some vortices traveling from the front wheel or from front wing downstream, or we have large structures from the tires that we need to keep. So those are the areas that we need to resolve properly. Underneath the car, very, very important. The car is running close to the ground. In that region where we create a fair amount of suction and downforce, it's very important that we have enough resolution. But also behind the car is quite important, because all those structures, they propagate downstream and behind the car, and to be able to predict the forces accurately in the end, we also need to resolve the wake region behind the car, what happens behind the car. Because if we don't do that, we don't have enough resolution behind the car, we will not predict the forces very accurately either. So that's another important thing. Then obviously we have the far field. Where do we place the far field? What kind of cell resolution do we need in the far field? Something to think about just in general. The other thing is that it's very important that we have a smooth distribution in terms of cell size. So on the surface we have nice elements where we have smaller elements, maybe around the leading edge of the wing, and then we have a gradual expansion to larger cells and so on. So we really would like to avoid large jumps in cell size. Now, when we're doing this kind of meshing, we're doing with these tools, with Snappy Hex and OpenFOAM, we typically rely on hexahedral elements, and then we cannot have a gradual expansion in cell size. We can only have an expansion with a factor of 2 when we divide hexahedrals into smaller elements. That's kind of the nature of that kind of meshing strategy. But what we can think about at least is that when we go from one cell size to a bigger one, where we have one refinement box, when we're moving up to a larger cell size, at least we put those transition regions in areas that are not super critical. So at least in areas where we have strong flow gradients, we have kind of a uniform cell distribution. That is also something important to think about. And that sort of, end of the day, kind of gives you some kind of rules of the extension of your refinement boxes, where you can go from one size to another one. And then obviously another important thing, end of the day, and people often tend to forget that they are happy they get the mesh through the process and they jump away to the simulations. But please also check the quality of your mesh. There are different measures. I'm sure Mila can speak about that also later, but there are all different quality measures, metrics to look for. What is a good mesh? And if it's not good enough, try to locate the areas where you have the bad cells. Perhaps they are not in an important area, maybe you can live with it, but it will always be a penalty in terms of convergence. If you have bad cells, the simulation will converge less well. It will take longer to converge. So quite often what you have to do is to go back to your CAD, maybe to fix up something and mesh it again. So please always check the quality of your mesh and try to understand those metrics. They are metrics in terms of skewness, orthogonality and things like that. I won't go into the details, but it's as a good practice to always do that once you get your final mesh. Now, so let's move on to the next phase. When we have this perfect mesh, what do? well, we have to set up the safety simulation in terms of boundary conditions and select different schemes for solving and so on. And here again, as I said a little bit before about the simulation domain, it's quite important to have a large domain. And the reason for this is that this is where we apply the boundary condition. And typically what we do, we don't know that the conditions normally around the car, but if we are very far away from the car, we can assume that the air is not feeling the influence from the car, and we can apply uniform free stream conditions. But if the domain is too small, we will have something they call solid blockage. So we will get an effect from the boundary condition that will basically affect the flow distribution around the car. So good practice is to have a reasonably large domain, and when I say reasonably large, that could mean that maybe you need to have your outlet condition behind the car, maybe 5 to 10 car lengths downstream. And in the same way upstream, maybe you have to have at least 5 car lengths upstream in your domain, so that your solid blockage becomes very, very small. Otherwise, it's kind of a situation where you simulate the car in some kind of a very, very big wind tunnel, and you get the effects from the tunnel walls, and that's not really what we want to simulate. We want to simulate free air conditions. Then obviously you have special boundary conditions set up for say the moving ground, for rotating wheels, and porous media for the radiators. I think something that Milad presented to you already in the previous session. But those are, so that they are different conditions, so always be a bit careful to check that you have your rotation axis and wheel rotation centers correctly prescribed and so on. The other thing very, very important here is obviously the turbulence modeling. We are solving the Reynolds average Navier-Stokes equations, and we are not really solving for turbulence. We are modeling turbulence somehow with a model. And here, one very important aspect is to have a model that goes well with your mesh. Typically what we do, we're using wall functions. We're not really resolving the boundary layers close to the wall down or direct to the viscous sublayers, but we're using a limited set of well controlled mesh cells close to the surface to end up with some kind of typical measurement of Y plus in the order of 30 to 100. And this is Y plus is kind of a measure of a non-dimensional wall normal distance. So what I'm trying to say is that you need to pick a suitable turbo model that works with the mesh you have. Now with the strategy that SimScale has provided you here, they will always provide you with a mesh where you use this kind of wall function approach, and also what they recommend in terms of turbulence modeling is probably correct. But just in general, as a philosophy, always think about turbulence model. It has to go well with the kind of mesh you have, the kind of resolution you have, especially close to wall boundaries, to how you resolve the boundary layers and so on. The other thing, obviously, is the numerical schemes. If possible, always run second-order schemes. First-order schemes are more stable, but are also much more dissipative. So in order to predict forces accurately, second-order schemes are always recommended. And obviously, very, very important, again, we're running steady state, so we're trying to converge to a steady state. So it's very important to check the convergence rate both in the flow residuals. It's like how the velocity residuals, the pressure residuals changing with iteration, and typically they should converge several orders of magnitude, maybe 3 to 4 orders of magnitudes. And also look at forces, obviously. But it could also be that it looks like forces have converged, but the flow residuals have not converged. And that could be a sign that something is wrong. So please check both flow residuals and forces in terms of convergence. Another kind of recommendations is that, if possible, you should base your analysis, your final post-processing of the data on some kind of average flow quantities. even if you're running steady state and all the forces and the residuals have converged and everything looks nice, especially if we start to do small design iterations, design change, if we look for small difference in the flow, then it's very important that we do some kind of flow averaging. So basically, we at say the last 20% of your iterations, we start to collect average data in terms of flow, velocities and pressure. So we get average quantities in the end, because otherwise it's going to be very difficult to compare, and we can sort of make the wrong conclusions by just happen to pick the result at a certain iterations in time. And if we would have done a few more iterations, we would have got some different results. So if when it's possible, we should do some averaging even for steady state. Then in general, so we talked about a little bit on CAD model, on the meshing and setup of the solving. Just a few general recommendations in terms of aero development strategies. This also goes back to what I was saying a little bit earlier about the aero mapping kind of thing, where you weight different positions of the car to come up with kind of a merit number. Think about it, what are the most important driving conditions? What are the conditions we need to consider when we optimize the aerodynamic performance of the car? Well, if you think about Formula Student cars, they are traveling at relatively low speed. And what that means is that any kind of side wind that we might have, and typically there is always some kind of wind coming from somewhere, that would mean in your case that the side wind influence can be quite significant. So that means that we should not really design the car for ultimate peak performance at say a single flow condition like straight ahead case. This is very, typically we are quite tempted to run straight ahead cases, because also that means that we can quite often treat the things as being completely symmetric, and we can cheat a little bit and we can simulate half a car with symmetry conditions. But if you think about it, end of the day, the car will rarely see those kind of straight ahead conditions, and in particular since the speed is so low, there will always be some kind of influence from side wind. So it's probably better to simulate a couple of side wind conditions. We can also simulate straight ahead, obviously, but side wind is important, and we would like to develop a car that is not extremely sensitive to small changes in side wind. And basically we want to have some kind of, we don't want to have a peaky design, we want to have a robust design. So whether we're running at 0 degree, 2 degree or 3 degrees of yaw angle side wind, we should have very similar performance on the car. Then also the drivability of the car will be much better and the handling will be better. The other thing I would like to say that, remember, we are running a steady state here. We treat the flow as being completely steady and not changing with time. But remember, all, say, flows in reality, the nature, there's always some sense of unsteadiness in there, even that they might be small in many circumstances, and it's perfectly okay to simulate a steady state. But I say that this is because you should treat steady state results with some caution, and there could be that once we do some steady state simulation, we end up with structures which are sort of average structures. They are average in time and space, but in reality they might not even exist, or at least not in that position where we see them. And this is very typical for, if we look about the tire wakes. We have the exposed tire to the wheel, and we try to compute the steady state solution around those exposed tires. And we will get some kind of structure behind the tire with this kind of a swirling vortex kind of shaped structure. But in reality, we will have an unsteady shedding going from left to right, you know, and if you take the average of that, we'll get something very different that doesn't really exist in reality. So there are situations and circumstances that we see structure in this kind of steady state average simulation that are very, very different in real life. That is something to bear in mind, really. And also use common sense. if we do a minor change in geometry design, we would not expect to see a significant change in the results typically. So if you see that, be very cautious and try to understand, can this really be real, or is there something else going on? Is this a numerical effect, or is there something else going on? And again, this is coming back to, say, examples where we have how we model the tire contact patch. We need to have a very robust kind of representation of the tire shape and how it meets the ground. If we start to see big changes, especially around the tires in the flow, we have to be a bit careful. That could be pure numerics. Then just in general, then moving into now to say post-processing, what should we be looking for in doing the post-processing in the flow analysis? Just a few general ideas. Something that is very good now is the first you do is to check your boundary conditions, because it will be very obvious if you have put the wrong boundary conditions somewhere. For instance, you should check that your wheels are rotating in the right direction. It's very easy to do that by plotting some x velocities or so. Also, please check your far field boundary. Quite often people kind of forget that because it's not interesting what's happening in the far field, but it will be very obvious if you have put the wrong boundary condition somewhere, or you see some disturbance propagating out to the far field boundary. So please have a look, plot some pressures, some velocities on your far field boundaries, just to see that they look okay. Make sure that your ground plane is moving with the right speed and in the right directions, things like that. If you have a porous media for your radiator, maybe plot the pressure drop over the radiator just to see that, is that what you would expect from the law you're prescribing something from Darcy's law, possibly where you have for a certain velocity, incoming velocity, you would expect a certain pressure drop. Is that what you see when you plot pressure over your radiator? So that it's kind of a check again that you have put in the right boundary conditions. The other thing to check is the state of your boundary layer. So look at some quantities on the surface of your car, and typically we're going to see we want to look at some viscous effects. So we should look at shear stress or skin friction coefficient, because this can give you a hint of the state of the boundary layer. Is it close to separating? Is it the healthy flow, or do we have some separations and so on, very strong pressure gradients? Because that can also indicate to us if this design is on the edge, is this really close to having some parts separating or so, or everything looks fine possibly. So it's a good practice to start to display some shear stress or other quantity that can display viscous effects close to the surface to get an idea of that. And then next thing to check obviously is that to check the off-surface flow, where we expect the big structures to propagating, like the wake of the tires, or if you have some vortices traveling from the front wing. Try to see if they are captured well when you move downstream. Maybe we do cut planes with constant X and we sweep downstream on the car. If the structure are disappearing very quickly, maybe that's an indication that your mesh is too coarse. And that will become very obvious when we look at things like total pressure that I will show you shortly. And then we try to be consistent when you plot things with colors. When you pick a color scale and a range, be consistent in that. So otherwise it's going to be very difficult to compare one plot from another if they are different color range and color scales. And if possible, use delta plots to highlight differences. I will explain shortly what delta plots are with an example. So let's recapture a little bit about pressure coefficient. I think you talked about that in one of the previous sessions, because we're going to look at a lot of pressures. We're going to look at static pressure and total pressure, and we will do that in terms of pressure coefficients. So just try to recapture what are the pressure coefficients. Here's a picture of a race car where I highlighted two pitot pressure probes. The big one at the top is some extra device that they used to add in here for some aerodynamic testing, but the one at the front is normally on the race car, and they have that to measure total pressure and static pressure, and with that they can also calculate the speed of the car relative to the wind. And what is a pitot pressure probe? Well, it's kind of a tube where here at the front we are measuring what we call the total pressure or stagnation pressure, because basically we are decelerating the flow to zero here at the bottom of this chamber, and that's where we get the static, the total pressure or stagnation pressure. So we are decelerating the flow to zero. On the side here, on the yellow, we are not sort of affecting the airflow in a significant way. And here we are measuring what is called the pressure or the static pressure. And if we think about, if we remember Bernoulli's equations from school, where he said that the total pressure is constant along a streamline in incompressible flow. So we said that the P total is equal P static plus something we call P dynamic, and this is constant along a streamline. So the dynamic pressure, that is really the difference between the total pressure and the static pressure. With the pitot probe, we are measuring both total and static pressure, and the difference is the dynamic pressure, which is 1/2 rho v square. Rho is then the density of the air. So then let's introduce the concept of pressure coefficients. It's quite convenient to try to normalize pressure with some reference pressure just to get them non-dimensionalized, and that's because otherwise it's very difficult to compare if we are comparing results from where we simulate the cars at different speed and so on. So it's very convenient to have a non-dimensional coefficient. And basically the pressure coefficient Cp is just the static pressure normalized with this dynamic pressure, as we saw. First we subtract a reference pressure, which is typically normal atmospheric pressure. And that's also for convenience, because the normal atmospheric pressure is like 100,000 pascals, something like that. So it's better to work with small numbers. So we subtract first the reference atmospheric pressure, and we divide with the dynamic pressure. That gives us the pressure coefficient Cp. And we do the same with the total pressure, which then the total pressure coefficient is actually Cp plus then the ratio of the local dynamic pressure with the dynamic pressure in the free stream. Then we have those two numbers to look at. And just to illustrate an example here where we have, if we think about this as being a streamline, if we look far away from the car, so we are out in the free stream where the flow is not feeling the influence from the car, we would expect Cp of 0, and a Cp total of 1. So this is where we have the undisturbed free stream flow. And then at the stagnation of the car, say at the nose of the car, we would expect, again, the total pressure to be 1 because it should be constant along the streamline, and we will have a stagnation pressure where Cp also is 1. Now, if we try to illustrate this with an example where we try to render the pressures on and around the Formula 1 car. So what we see here is then that the surfaces of the car, they are rendered with the pressure coefficient Cp, whereas the structures in the flow field around the car, typically here the tire wake, they are visualized with the total pressure Cpt. And if we were to integrate now this static pressure distribution, that would give us the pressure forces of the car, which then we can equate to downforce and drag and so on. But the total pressure we see here is actually quite useful to identify and look at for flow structures, things that propagates in the region around the car, and this could be like energy losses areas or low energy, like typically the tire wake, but it could also be other structures like vortices from the front ring traveling downstream. Then total pressure coefficient is very, very useful to identify and to locate those structures. Let's also quickly make a kind of a definition of force coefficients. In a similar fashion, we would like to have non-dimensionalized coefficients for forces, instead of talking about downforce and drag in newtons, it can be quite useful to have coefficients here as well. And it's the same philosophy, really. So we would like to have something called CX or CD, maybe for drag. So that is really the force in x direction divided by some kind of reference force. And again, for Q here, we use the dynamic pressure in the free stream, 1/2 rho v square. And then we need an area to divide this to become non-dimensionalized. So typically what we would use is the projected frontal area of the car. So then we can have the Cx would be the drag coefficient, and Cz would be then the downforce coefficient. So this is again independent of the speed of the car. Okay, so let's start to look at some data. So as we already seen, we can look at various things. We can look at the pressures on the surface, or we can look at some viscous effects on the surface like friction, or we can look at things in the volume around the car in terms of streamlines or isocontours and so on. Let's start with CP distribution. So here's an example now where we're plotting the pressure coefficient on the surface of the car. To the left, we see a simulation with straight ahead conditions. So there is no side wind at all. And we're looking at CP in a relatively narrow scale from -1 to +1. So +1 is really where we have stagnation, red colors. -1 means we have suction, basically, or lower pressure, lower than atmospheric pressure. To the right, we see the same kind of setup, but we're simulating 3 degrees of side wind. And at the first kind of glimpse, when you look at those plots, it's not so easy to recognize where are the big differences, because it's all kind of very greenish everything when we plot it in this kind of color scale and this kind of range, and it's not so easy to understand what are the differences here. So then it's quite useful if you can do these delta plots I was talking about. So we try to subtract the side wind case from the headwind case and really plot the difference. So this is delta CP plotting at the surface, and we have narrowed the scale for ±0.25. And gray here means there are really no difference, and blue and red, those are the areas where we see differences on the surface of the car. And this is a good way then when you start to develop the car, you start to change some geometrical features. You would have to expect not dramatic changes, obviously, because typically what you do, you evolve your design around the baseline. So you don't expect to see big differences, but this is kind of a way to highlight those differences and make it clear to you where they occur and so on, looking at the delta plots. And obviously, we could do the same also with total pressure. Now we want to look at the flow around the car, not on the surface. So if we look here on the left, we animate here. We are moving some cut planes in the vertical direction, so we are basically slicing through the car. This is the straight ahead case. And we can see all those areas that are green, yellow, blue, they represent losses in the flow field, basically. And if you look at this for a while, you will start to see that the influence from the tires is quite significant. You have large regions of low energy flow behind the front wheels, for instance. But you can also see some very dominant structures from the front wing. If we let this one run again here, there will be a vortex leaving from the front wing. Here you see the trace of a vortex, quite strong. Now we can animate this guy here as well, which is the side wind. Just by looking like this, they're not extremely different, but you start to notice here around the front tire, the wind is coming from below here. So the flow will be different at the front, and it's quite well exposed how the front tire wakes are different when you have a little bit of a side wind. It becomes very obvious when you do the plots again. If you do a delta plot, so we subtract the side wind case from the headwind case, and we plot the difference. So now we see the difference in total pressure around the car, and we see all these large blue and red structures, and a lot of them are associated with the wheels, the front wheels, but also we can here start to see how the position of the vortex from the front wing has changed because of the side wind and so on. So it is these kind of animations you have to digest for a while. You have to look at them over and over again to try to understand what's going on. But it's a useful way to present the data. However, probably what I think the best way to look at those kind of simulations is one of the simplest things: extract cut planes. Just planar cuts through the car. So we slice the car like bread. We slice it in Y, Z, and X direction. And obviously we want to do many cuts. So we are slicing the car downstream and upstream and horizontally and so on. And in all those cut planes, we can look at static pressure, total pressure, velocity. There will be many things. So end of the day, we typically end up with thousands of cut planes, maybe for a single simulation. So could it be that we are extracting a lot of data, and we need to have some good strategy also how to handle that and how to process that. But I'm not going to talk about that today. But I think the message here is that the simple stuff like cut planes are excellent, and looking at total pressure to identify structure off the surface is excellent. Static pressure or CP, we look on the surface of the car, because end of the day they represent the distribution of the forces, so you can get an idea of where you're creating downforce, where you're creating drag, and so on. Now I think we can move on to some examples to show on the Formula Student cars, and obviously look a bit different to a Formula 1 car, but topologically they are not very different. They have 4 wheels in the corners that are exposed to the airstream. They have a huge front wing and a huge rear wing and a flat underbody, and they have some side pods with radiators. So topologically they are quite similar. So here we have an example again. We are looking at CP, the pressure coefficient. So we're in a scale from 1 to -2. So we would expect here red at the nose of the car where we have stagnations, CP should be 1. If we see in a simulation that we're getting CP well beyond 1, that could be an indication that something is not perfectly correct. Either it's not converged, or there's some problem with your modeling setup with your mesh. You would expect to see it close to 1. It could be a little bit higher than 1, but it should not be significantly higher than 1. In a lower scale, you can have very low numbers CP. You can get a lot of suction in some areas. And we see here underneath the cars where we have these regions of deep blue on the front wing and rear wing, where we create a lot of suction. And that's also areas that gives large contributions to the downforce in this case. Here is an example of those slices again, X slices of total pressure. They are excellent to illustrate, to find structures in the flow field. We would expect those plots to be red in the far field, so we have CPT01 as we said in the far field, undisturbed flow. And then we see those kind of bluish areas here around the end plate of the front wing. This could be vortices, but it could also be some kind of viscous losses. We have separations in the junction here, for instance. Or if we look here to the right, we see the trace of the front wheel wake structures where we have low energy flow. And those are the structures that we would like to follow downstream, to see where they go, where they propagate, because basically they are low energy. We don't want them under the floor. We don't want them to affect your rear wing, for instance, or your diffuser. So those are the things to look for here. Same thing here, but we're looking in a Y-cut, looking from the side. We can see here that we have a pretty healthy flow underneath the car. It's very red here, a lot of energy coming here. And also we can get an idea of how the rear wing is working. Here's another cut, and there is an indication here something is getting blue. It almost looks like the rear wing here is separating, losing some performance. So those are the kind of things we want to look for when we slide through the wings, that ideally we would like to have them attached and not separated. So here could be an indication that something is happening here in this blue region. Now Milad and his colleagues have prepared some results here overnight where they ran case at straight ahead conditions, zero, and also with side wind with 20 degrees of yaw angle. So here we would expect some very clear differences in those results. And here we're looking at surface pressure again, pressure coefficient from -1 to +1, and we see now stagnation region here. This should in principle be symmetric results. We see stagnation here. Here we can see that the stagnation point has moved to the side, meaning that we have a strong side wind component. It's also clear here on the driver's head that the stagnation point has moved. If we start to look here a little bit from the side, we can see on the wing side, we can clearly see the effect of the yaw angle here. Particularly, it's very clear here on the rear wing end plate, and we have a side some component. We have this red area here with higher pressure also on the side point. It's very clear that the wind is hitting from the side. We're looking at the leeward side. Again, something is probably happening around the rear wing. We have low pressure here. Maybe the flow cannot stay attached. Maybe it separates. I don't know. We have to look in closer detail. But you can clearly see the effect on the rear wing end plate on the side wind. And obviously, you can also see it around the tires and so on. Again, here some slices. It's a vertical X-cut through the rear wing. You can really see here what creates the downforce of the wing. You have higher pressure on top here, red, and you get the suction below. You can almost understand here that you're losing downforce, at least in this section. It's less blue when you go to the yaw case here. You have some losses on the end plate here. There's something happening here. So this is a nice illustration how the wing is losing performance with the yaw condition, probably. Again, now we're looking from the top, and we have three cases. We have 0 yaw, we have 12-degree yaw, and we have 20 degrees yaw. Well, we can look at this in great detail, but we don't see huge difference on top. Well, we see some areas. Typically, the upper surface themselves are not so critical. It's not really on the upper surface you're generating downforce. It's really on the lower surfaces where you generate suction that is important. And now here we're looking from below. We can see there's quite some significant effects of the yaw conditions where we see that, for instance, if we look at the front wing here, it's very blue, very uniformly distributed. With side wind here, we're starting to lose suction in a big portion of the wing. We can also see the effect here on the rear wing, for instance. It's also losing downforce with yaw angle, and the floor gets affected as well. Quite clearly here. It's 0 yaw, it's quite blue, nicely distributed. Here we're losing suction very clearly because of the side wind. So ideally, when we develop the car, these are quite extreme yaw angles, but when we develop the car, we would like to have it a little bit numb to the yaw angles. We don't want to have a big drop off in downforce with the yaw angle, because then the car is going to be very difficult to drive. And we don't want the center of pressure to change too much in terms of cornering, braking, and so on. So we want kind of a stable car in that respect. So here are some cuts through the ground plane, I believe, where we're now looking at total pressure instead. So we see these are the footprints on the tires. This is a trace from the front wing on the ground plane. We see those pressure, and we can see how the structure are changing with yaw angle. So again, this is also illustrating how the ground effect is changing on the close to the front wing with yaw angle. We can also see that things are happening around the tires and the contact patches. We have some structures. And these are plots very typical. They're very useful also to look how the flow look around the tires and in the interaction with the ground and so on. Can give you some indications. Again, some slices, X slices at various yaw angles. So here we have 0, 4, 8, 12, 16, 20 degrees, and one observation we can see here is very clear. These green structures are basically the front wheel wakes we have seen propagating. We can see how they change with yaw angle when we increase the yaw angle. The leeward kind of tire wake is propagating outwards, whereas the windward tire wake here is more kind of climbing up on the bodywork. getting closer to the driver here. And that could also be a problem, maybe not so much on this kind of car because the rear wing is very high, but on the Formula One car, a very typical problem is when they have high yaw angles, is that this kind of front tire wake structure is going to propagate down in and enter in below the rear wing, so it will affect the performance of the rear wing, and typically what would happen then with the yaw angle, we lose performance of the rear wing because of the front tire wake is shedding in below the rear wing itself. Here I believe it should be an animation where we're slicing through the car through the front to the rear, and we're comparing yaw 0 with this 20-degree yaw angle, and you can see a massive difference here from the very beginning how the front wing gets affected and how the tire wakes are really being different. And also look underneath the floor where it's much more red here and less red here in the yaw case, meaning that you're not getting as good airflow underneath the floor of the car. And also you see these huge structures here and losses in the junction of the end plate. So maybe it's actually useful to play it again. As I said, these kind of things you should look at many times, and this is the first time I look at myself. But you see these structures here from front wing. There's some losses here coming on because due to the high yaw angle, and you also saw the contact patch from the front tires with the ground. Typically, it's kind of what we call a tire jet propagating from the front tire. You can see how it affects the floor, diffuser, and so on. Another thing to think about is that those kind of structures from the front wheels and the tires propagate. You don't want to digest them into your cooler either, because then it could affect your cooling performance. Okay, let's move on. So we have again another set of slices, horizontal slices. We're slicing through the car, again comparing those yaw angles. It's very clear from here what's happening, say, at the front wing. The leeward side of the front wing end it gets a bit distressed here. We have some little bit of separation here, maybe probably separation here as well of the end plate. And here's the same thing. We're animating from the ground up. It's really kind of a very nice, useful way to visualize things and really to understand where the differences are. So again, remember we're looking here at total pressure. Total pressure is really good to visualize structures in the flow field. When we see this green or blue structure, typically they represent losses of energy, but it can also represent areas where we have actually strong structure, like a strong vortex. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something negative. It could also be something where we have, I would say, very low pressure. And in the core of a vortex, we can get a very low total pressure, but it could also be something useful that could be used to your advantage, basically. Okay, so end of the day, then we can, if we integrate those results, we integrate our pressures on the surface, we will end up with forces. And here we are just illustrating how the forces on the various components of the car are changing with yaw angle. So we have the yaw angle here on the horizontal axis, and here we have, now we're not looking at the coefficient, we're actually looking at actual forces in newtons. So this will see how the rear wing itself, how the drag of the rear wing is changing with yaw angle. It's a kind of funny shape. I cannot really explain it right away why that is. It's not what we would expect possibly. But otherwise we can see that the drag is not changing dramatically. This is the bodywork, and here we have the front wing and the diffuser, the rear diffuser. So the drag is not dramatically affected by the yaw angle, and that we wouldn't expect that either. Probably more interesting to look at lift or downforce in this case, so which should really be, say, negative numbers. So if we look at, say, the rear wing, which is this curve here again versus yaw angle, we see we have a kind of a small drop off with yaw angle, and that's really what you would expect to see, because we saw from the plus we are losing pressure, we're losing suction on the rear wing with yaw angle. so we will see it drop off, and the same goes with the front wing. And this is the kind of characteristics that we are very interested to look at when we are designing the car. We would like to have this kind of very low sensitivity to yaw angle. So when we're yawing the car, we don't want to lose a lot of downforce. So that's why it's important to optimize the car around a set of yaw angles. So basically, we would like to have this curve as flat as possible, but we don't want to have a big drop-off. This looks to me quite reasonable, actually. And then we can also look at side force, and here we see really what sticks out is the side force here on the rear wing, and I'm guessing it's because we have these very large end plates, and with this large component of side wind, we will get a significant side force. I think that's kind of the end of my presentation. I think now we're supposed to get back to Milad.
Thank you very much. Torbjörn, thank you very much for this great presentation. I also learned a lot of interesting things, and I'm quite happy that you will stay with us till the end of the webinar and be available for questions from the audience.
Absolutely.
Great. Then I will just take over the presenter's role, Torbjörn.
Yes, please do.
Continue with my part of the presentation. Okay, great. You should be able to see my screen right now. Great. Okay, then let's start. In the meantime, guys, you can also write your questions which you want to ask Torbjörn to the question window, and my colleagues will collect them. So let's continue, and as you know, it's time for our live demo. But before we actually start with our today's live demo, I would like to talk with you about some aspects of result convergence, result quality. And in the forum, you may took a look, there were some confusions regarding the quality of results and when a CFD result is, let's say, finished. And as I told you during the last two sessions, CFD is based on a numerical approach, which is solving the Navier-Stokes equation using an iterative algorithm. And iterative means in this case that we're using the output from our iteration as the input to the next iteration. And as you can remember, our simulation for a steady state case starts with initial conditions, and basically the idea is that with every iteration, this initial condition will converge more and more to the actual solution of our flow field. And if you take a look at the screen right now, you can see this animation. And this animation basically shows the representation or the distribution of velocity and pressure coefficient around the symmetric plane of this motorbike. It's the external aerodynamics case. And the change is because of the time step we are changing. So this is not the physical time, but the simulation iteration. As you can see at the beginning here, sorry, I was too quick. Here at the beginning, it's iteration 65. Basically, the whole result is crap. It's a very chaotic field, and also from a physical perspective, it makes not really a lot of sense. I mean, here you see a velocity distribution, which is like completely wrong, and the same for the pressure distribution. But if we wait a little bit, you can see that for every iteration, the result is becoming more and more realistic. And starting from, sorry, I have to again go back, and starting from, let's say, iteration 500, we have only like a ready solution, and then we have just some small oscillations. Here, starting from 250 iterations, we have just oscillations of the value. And this is what Torbjörn was mentioning, by the way, that it makes sense sometimes to average the results. And the issue with the homework was that some people, just to put it in a nutshell, made an error with the mesh definition, so they had a bad quality mesh, and the result was that they needed more iterations till the result converged. And so let's therefore take a look at 3 different options or indicators which can help us to understand if our simulation is converged or not. First of all, on the platform, we have this chart representation where you can see the so-called residuals. And basically, the residuals are the error in the solution of the system of equations we are using. Just imagine you can apply this conservation principle on every cell and for every quantity. And this is what we can see on this graph basically. So you see, in this case, it's the average, so for all cells, the average error for the 3 components of velocity, for pressure, continuity, K, and omega. And you can see that this error becomes smaller and smaller. And basically, our final aim is that all these curves get as low as possible so that the error is as small as possible. And but in practice, that will never happen. So actually, we are looking for a state where the residuals are not changing anymore, and we have like a converged stable solution. And this is very important to keep this in mind. Even if your residuals are looking perfect, that only means that your solution is numerically converged, but a CFD simulation can numerically converge into a wrong physical solution. And to find out this, we will take a look, or it's helpful to take a look at forces or integrals in general. Just one thing about the residuals. Some people ask why we have this jump. And basically, if you have a jump like this, most of the time, the reason is that something changed in the physics of a flow field. For example, separation starts to occur, and then you have this change. So at least when doing such a simulation, you should run enough iterations to make sure that nothing will change anymore. Next thing I talked about already is to take a look at forces on general integrals. What you can see here is that we just plotted for against number of iterations the force coefficients for drag and lift. Drag is red, lift is green. And here you see that we have like this oscillating graphs at the beginning, and after 60 iterations they start to converge. And in contrast to the residuals, here we are not aiming to have a very low number but a very constant number, because this means that from iteration to iteration the change in forces is very small, so this is like a very good global indicator for stability. And by the way, we cannot only apply this on forces but also on like fluxes or temperatures if we have a CHG simulation. And finally, we can also use probes. So we can put some probe in the flow field, and it's basically quite similar to the force coefficient, but it's more like a local indicator. And we're tracking here a variable's value really at a particular location. Great. And especially residuals and force coefficients are available on the SimScale platform, and I really suggest to take a look at them to make sure your solution is converged. Great. I also talked about mesh quality sometimes, and as you can remember, the mesh represents the, let's say, spatial discretization of the fluid flow domain. And since the volumes, the control volumes of the mesh are depending on each other, there are some certain limits in regards of the structure of the overall mesh as well as the distribution of the cells. And basically, if you take a look at the SimScale platform in the mesh operation, you will find an item in this project tree called mesh log. And there you will find the log file output of the meshing algorithm. And this is just what I copied from the platform. This is the last section of this log file, which is very useful because it contains a lot of information about the mesh in general, but also about the mesh quality. So first of all, here we can see the number of cells inside the mesh, and they are sorted by the refinement level. So we have like 100,000 cells of a cell size level 0, and we have like 2.5 million cells with a cell size of level 8. Then you can also see here like how long it took to route the mesh and calculate the mesh. And starting from here, we have our mesh quality indicators. And basically, we have certain criteria. I will not discuss all with you, but we will just, in the next minutes, talk a little bit about one of those criteria. But basically, you can read about this criteria in documentation. And here we are counting how many cells are like not fulfilling this criteria. And in general, it would be great to have a perfect mesh without any illegal cells. But sometimes you cannot avoid it. And then it's important to reduce those cells. So we have here like 73 illegal cells in like nearly 15 million, in 8.2 million cells. So this is still okay. And for example, one criteria which is very important is the so-called orthogonality of the mesh. And there are a lot of different, let's say, criteria. Some are applied, or some are about the structure, the geometry of a single cell. Some are about more mathematical. But for example, orthogonality is very important, since it's like describing how much your mesh is banded. And just imagine if, let's say, a fluid flow goes like parallel to the x-axis through the cell, and the cell is banded very much, then the normal direction, let's say, of the cell is a different direction than the flow direction. And basically the orthogonality can be calculated from the area vector of the two cells and the distance between the center of the two cells. So it's basically the angle between this surface normal, or the area vector of the common surface, and the distance between the two centers. And this should be at least smaller than 75 degrees. If some cells are not fulfilling this criteria, this is okay, but we should try to reduce it as much as possible. And by the way, so all illegal cells are counted here and then printed out here. So just if you ask yourself what mean illegal cells. Okay, then yes. I hope this helped you a little bit. If you have more questions regarding mesh quality, just ask them in our forum. And Torbjörn showed you just some minutes ago the Sidewind study. And today I want to show you how to create the Sidewind study yourself. And basically the setup is very similar to the simulation setup we discussed last week. We just have one very important change. Since the flow field for your study is not symmetric, we can't use the half symmetric model anymore. We have to use a full car model this time. So including the full car here. And I would suggest let's just start to take a look at this project, which I've already set it up. And since the setup is so similar, I will just talk with you roughly about the biggest changes. So here's the model. It's basically the same model. The only difference is that we mirrored it completely so that we have the full car. And first of all, let's take a look at this mesh project. And the first thing which you will notice is that the bounding box has a different overall size. So the mesh is already finished, so don't be confused. And now we have to wait some seconds until the mesh is loaded, since it's a very big mesh. It's like 15 million cells. Okay, and just to let you know, we will talk next week a lot about how to improve mesh quality with modifying the CAD model. So, but if you have questions related to that, we can also discuss them just in the next minute during the Q&A. And as long as this is loading, I think we can already see it. We have expanded the bounding box specially in Y direction, because we will use a very special approach to simulate this yaw angle. In theory, we would need for every yaw angle our own mesh, and this would create a lot of repetitive work. Therefore, we will just create a simulation of the car without any yaw angle, and then apply this yaw angle by changing the boundary condition. I will just show you what this means basically, but this is the first big difference between the last simulation and the simulation of this session. Please also keep in mind that the overall mesh size is not increasing so much because we're changing the dimension of the bounding box, since the cell size is very rough in the far field of the flow. And our mesh is loaded completely, so we'll change the representation to surfaces. And then, so here you can see how we increase the bounding box around the car. And what we will do in difference now, you will see it also later, is that we will here apply a yaw angle to the inlet flow and use a special boundary condition for this and that wall, that we have no interaction. Okay, then another difference is basically that we have more cells because of the full model, and there are some very important settings. So this is something which was basically didn't change, but I would just want to mention it again. It's very important to put this option on false, otherwise your mesh quality will decrease and then you need more iterations. There are also some other mesh control parameters you should modify, but you will find them in the step-by-step instruction. Okay, and now let's take a look at the simulation setup. As I mentioned, the biggest difference are the boundary conditions here. Since we have no symmetrical plane, we don't have a symmetric boundary condition here too. And maybe just let's talk about one common mistake which was made during the last week's homework. It's very important if you apply the boundary conditions. Every phase of the fluid zone needs its own boundary condition, but you should never apply a boundary condition to these three interface zones. Here, here, or here. However, as I mentioned, the inlet, now we defined an inlet vector with two components. You can calculate the components with basic trigonometry. And to make sure that, because just imagine if you would have here an angle, the flow would hit the wall, we used for this, we also applied this boundary condition to all outer walls except the top, the floor, and the outlet. Okay, then we just start the simulation, and here you can see, by the way, the convergence plot. So, and you can see how the solution really converged. And if we take a look at the post-processor, for example, we can also see the force plot for the simulation, and then you can see how the forces converge, and they're still a little bit oscillating. And if you, for example, want to know the forces or calculate them, let's hide the other things we don't know. And then you can see, for example, the pressure as well as the viscous component, let's say, of the drag. This is a pressure component, and this is a viscous component. Well, and we can also take a look into the 3D simulation results. Here I've prepared something. In the tutorial we will show you, describe you more briefly how to post-process the result. What I've done here, basically, I have loaded only the surface of the car and only the pressure distribution. I hope it will update right now, it's loading. And then I also created a slice, calculated the total pressure and some streamlines. Well, now let's try. It's a quite big simulation, so it can take some time until it's completely loaded. I will just reload it. Great. So let's, in the meantime, until the post-processor loads, maybe just make a quick wrap-up. So basically, the mesh is quite similar. The only difference is that we have no symmetrical plane. And regarding the simulation setup, we used a very dedicated boundary conditions for the side walls and the inlet to be able to apply a yaw angle. And by the way, if you want to simulate cornering, you need a different approach. But about this we will talk also next week. Because if you want to simulate cornering, you also in theory would need a banded bounding box of fluid flow domain. But let's talk about that more in detail next week. And during the post-processing, I just showed you how to, I will show you just how to manipulate the slice and the streamlines. So let's take a look back. It's still loading. I'm sorry. Let's just wait for it to load, and then maybe during can show it to you after I've presented the homework to you. Okay, so in the end, let's talk about your homeworks first. So your homework will be to investigate this, your angle effect on your own. We will therefore provide you, I think, from tomorrow with the homework, including a step-by-step tutorial, a ready-to-use project with the geometry, and you have to create one mesh and one yaw angle simulation and submit the results then back to us. If you have questions or need support, please use our forum, and we will try to help you there as soon as possible. Okay, so then thank you very much for joining our today's webinar, and then I think it's now time for the Q&A session. So let me just unmute Torbjörn, and then I think we can start. And if you have questions, just write them down into our chat window. Okay, then let's start, Torbjörn. And there's already a first question by David. David wants to know what's the better approach when we defining tire contact patch with the ground. Building a brick around the wheel or cut the wheel? 10 to 12 millimeters. Thank you in advance.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's not so easy to answer maybe. One thing for sure, I mean, first of all, when you treat the tires, typically the tires have a different shape depending on the load of the car and the simulation you're doing, so the contact patch will look differently. So end of the day, you would like to have as close to as a realistic shape of the tire as possible if you have an idea how the tire looks. If you cut the tire close to the ground, there might be the risk that you're cutting away part of the tire that has been deformed, and that deformed portion could be important for the flow structures that propagate. So it depends. It could also be that you do some kind of combination of this. You cut the tires, cut away the lower portion, and then you put this kind of bricks around, you know, to get a good transition to the ground plane. I don't have a clear answer, but it's important that the side wall shape of the tire, and typically when you deform the tire, you get kind of a bulge, you know, of the tire expanding close to the ground plane. You don't want to cut that away, and you want to keep that at least for sure. But otherwise, you can probably, you have to do some kind of judgment here, really, what to do. The other thing I want to say is also that you need to have a good appreciation where the top of the tire sits. So you're not cutting the tire too much, or maybe if suppose you cut the tire and then you move it down to the ground plane, maybe the top of the tire will be in the wrong position. So that's also something to think about. I'm sorry for not being clearer than this, but hopefully it can give you some kind of...
No, Tom, thank you very much. I think it's obvious that this is very, let's say, a very detailed question. It also, I think, depends on, let's say, the overall CFD concept. Let's say if everything is very coarse, and then it may make no sense to investigate, I think, a lot of work for very realistic tire contact patch modeling. But I think if you want to do high-level CFD, for sure, you should make some thought what's the best solution there.
Yeah. This is really, if you think about what they do in Formula One, this is really one of the most difficult areas to simulate. First of all, that because you have really no clear idea what is the actual shape of the tire when the car is driving around the track, and the deformations you have. You try to simulate them with the FEA or something like that, and try to measure them with static loads. But at the end of the day, it's very difficult to know how the tire actually looks. So there will always be some kind of guesswork or some approximations there. So it's kind of those nightmare areas to try to model correctly.
Thank you very much. Next question is by Alejandro Martinez, and he said, not long ago I read that for Formula Student cars it would be optimum to design the car to have better aerodynamic performance for a specific yaw angle, let's say 5 degrees. What is your opinion about that?
I think, as I said during the presentation, because you're running at low speed, the yaw angle is very important here to consider, and so you should really look at the range of yaw angles, that you have a good design, not only straight ahead, but for sure you will spend probably most of your time at some kind of yaw angles. So 5 degrees sounds sensible to me. I think that's probably not a bad idea to optimize it around a few degrees of yaw angle.
Thanks. Next question is by Mislav, and his question is, since in Formula SAE there are lower speeds, you want to construct a setup with more downforce instead of a setup for reaching high speeds. Grip instead of top speeds. Do you think this is promising?
Yeah, no, I think in principle it's correct, because it's low speed. I don't know too much about Formula SAE cars, but I have a feeling that there will be an advantage to go for high downforce, which also I think, if you look at the car how they look, they have massive wings, they're huge wings, and that's, to me, is a clear indication that there is an advantage to develop for downforce and not top speed. So probably the drag, because these wings obviously generate also a lot of drag, a lot of induced drag, but it's probably less of an importance. So yeah, you will probably go for maximum downforce. That's my guess. But I have to be careful. I'm not an expert in Formula SAE, so I have to read a bit more about the cars. But that sounds reasonable.
Okay, thanks. And there's the next question by Joshua, and he wants to know if the pitching of a vehicle should be included in the CFD modeling when considering traveling around the corner, and in general what they have to take care about when they want to simulate cornering.
Yeah, for sure. It's as I said when we talked about aero mapping, the actual attitude of the car is very, very important. And if there is a driving condition that is very, say, predominant, where you spend a lot of time, you need to consider the pitch of the car, maybe even the roll of the car or the steer of the tires. That is very important. And in terms also of cornering, one thing you need to realize that what we're talking about here is side wind condition, yaw angles. In reality, we have a curved flow. When the car is cornering, it's actually sliding a bit around the corner. You have different slip angles on the front wheels and the front tires. So it's not exactly the same thing as simulating a yaw condition, because the yaw angle would vary. The front of the car would see a different yaw angle than the rear of the car. So a better approach would be to do that kind of cornering flow.
Thank you, Torbjörn. Next question by Niklas Pfeiffer. Which reference area do you recommend to use for calculating the lift coefficient? Would you use the projected area in X direction like used for the drag, or would you use the projected area in Z direction?
Now, you would use the same. You would use the same, the projected X direction, obviously. You have the same reference area for the, as you have for the car, basically, also for the wing. Then you can also think about, obviously, if you start to look at components, you can look at different reference areas. But typically, you keep the same reference area.
Okay, good to know. And next question is by Venkata Rinchindra, and he wants to know how do we decide when to use gurney flaps or vortex generators. I think he wants to know if it makes sense for such low velocities to use concepts including gurney flaps or vortex generators.
Gurney flaps could be useful for, at least say, for the rear wings, where when you go for maximum downforce, quite often you would find that adding a gurney flap would actually increase the efficiency of the rear wing. So you get out, say, if you look at the ratio of downforce to drag, which would be, say, your efficiency, by adding a gurney flap, you typically increase the efficiency of the wing operating close to maximum lift. So it could be that could help also here. It's possible, yes.
Okay, great. That's a very good question by Ali Benjazir. What is the future of CFD in Formula One? Which
Yeah,
technologies and especially numerical schemes will become relevant?
yeah. That is a very good question. I asked that myself as well. I don't know. As I told you, but they still have those kind of limitations in teraflops, meaning that today they are more or less forced to use steady run simulation, because even if they really would like to do unsteady simulation moving to DS or LDS, they cost too much in terms of teraflops, and they cannot really afford it because of the regulations. My feeling, though, is that one day in the future, people will start to realize that this is just stupid to have this kind of restriction, because you really won't like to formulate to push technology. So they will. Hopefully, we will see the day when they will be at the bleeding edge again, pushing the technology, doing more and more unsteady simulation, going to say wall resolved LES in the future. So, but I really don't know. I'm curious to find out the answer myself.
By the way, a lot of people asked us which tools we're using in the background, and I mean we are using OpenFOAM, and they asked themselves if a tool which is basically free can be good enough, let's say, for the pinnacle of external aerodynamics. What is your opinion about that, Torbjörn? I think you used both in your career, commercial tools as well as open source tools.
Yeah, yeah. And honestly, I think that there is good room for both of them. Uh, Open source tools are good in a way that they are based on, say, typical GPL licenses, so you don't have to pay a lot of money to get the license, which is really good when it starts to scale up things, when you do large-scale simulation. And then if you can buy computing time in the cloud, which is becoming more and more attractive and more, so say, affordable, it's an excellent approach, because you can scale up without having to pay a huge amount of licenses. Having said that, there's also probably a bigger hurdle to get over to become fluent and efficient in using OpenFOAM, for instance. You need to invest a little bit upfront to learn, and you don't typically have the good kind of documentation and maybe support that you can get from the software vendors. But on the other hand, the code is open, and you have the source code, and you're free to do what you want with it. So I'm in the past, and even still today, I'm kind of a mixed user. I use both a lot of open source, but also commercial software, depending on the project. So I think there is room for both in the future.
Okay, and there's I think a question which is very much related to that. Michael Reining wants to know which software have you been using for CFD at Sauber and Ferrari?
In principle, I'm not allowed to say that, but I think if you search on the internet, it's not a very well hidden secret.
Okay, so guys, you have just to Google a little bit, then you will find out. But I can tell you that I'm quite sure some teams are using OpenFOAM as well.
Yes, yeah. More and more, actually.
Yeah, I think it's a very positive signal. Okay, we have some final questions, and then I think we are done today with our sessions. One question is by Maxim, and he wants to know if it's necessary to use LESD as for correct calculations near to stall.
Yeah, it's also a good question. I mean, this is really one of the difficult areas to predict the stall on a wing when you're getting close to maximum lift. And really, end of the day, the best approach would be to do something like LES, where you're resolving everything and even calculate the transition from laminar to turbulent. But it's still very, very expensive, and you can only do it for say, limited cases. So having said that, though, there are some turbulence models today that are quite good, that has been they have some empirical models for transitions, and they have some good being able to do good predictions on wings at close to stall. But I think in the long run, you need to go to something like LES to be able to predict this with confidence. but it's too costly today.
Yes, for sure.
For most applications.
Yes, and I think for the purpose of Formula Student, K-Omega SST should be absolutely good.
It's a good choice, I think. Yeah, it's a good compromise. Yeah.
Perfect. Great. There seem to be not a lot of new questions anymore. Then I would like to thank Torbjörn for being here with us today. If you have maybe some questions, you can also write them in the forum, guys, and we will try to reach out to Torbjörn or to answer them on our own. Thank you very much for being with us today. Please, guys, work on your homework. The deadline for last week's homework ends on the day after tomorrow, 12 p.m. and we will provide you with the homework for this session tomorrow. Then, yes, again, thank you very much, Torbjörn, for being here with us today. Hope to see you soon again here at our webinars.
Thank you all. Yeah, thank you, Milad. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, so guys, have a nice week. See you next week. Bye.